And I'd like to make this clear at the outset when talking about a lost, advanced civilization, is I don't mean a civilization like ours.
Now, if we are looking at the faint fingerprints and traces of a lost civilization that explored and mapped the world more than 13,000 years ago, what other traces are there? Well, I wrote a whole book about this called Fingerprints of the Gods, so you'll find it all in there. But I want to concentrate on the spiritual side of things, because there is an astonishing spiritual continuity all around the world, and I'm going to speak of it today with specific focus to ancient Egypt, but also with a secondary focus on Cambodia. Again, the Piri-Reis map. It actually turns out to be drawn on a very modern projection, which is an azimuthal equidistant projection, and it's based on Cairo, where Giza is, where the pyramids of Giza are. So this seems a good opportunity to go to Giza. And here we find the majestic, the incredible, the mysterious Great Sphinx, speaking to us in riddles down the ages, this beautiful and majestic monument. And the pyramids themselves. My wife Santha took all of these photographs. She and I have been privileged to visit Egypt times beyond counting. There is something truly magical and mysterious about that site. It is a very special place on the world. It isn't the only special place, but it is extraordinarily special, and it touches the soul, and it touches something deep in us, and I believe that that's because it was designed to do that. The three great pyramids of Giza standing there in the desert like three stars brought down to earth. Now, one thing about the Great Pyramid you can tell immediately, even though you might not know anything else, is that astronomy was involved in creating it. The Great Pyramid is stunningly accurately aligned to true north, south, east, and west. It's actually within 3/60ths of a single degree of true north, and that is an incredible accurate alignment, especially when you're dealing with a monument with a footprint of 13 acres. It would be very hard to do it today. We probably could do it, but it would be difficult. And the architect would want to know why. I mean, why do you want to do that? We can build you this amazing, huge monument, but must it really be within 3/60ths of a single degree of true north? That's making the problem really, really huge. So it tells us not only were astronomers involved to get that level of accuracy, but also that it was important to them. It really mattered to them to be precise, to be on the button in that way. And a second thing which just will not go away at Giza, no matter how angry the archaeologists become, no matter how they swarm out of their nest and leap all over anybody who dares to criticize the existing paradigm. What will not go away is the hint of much greater antiquity surrounding the entire Giza complex. That's what won't go away. And that's what I want to look into a little bit just now. This is from the Temple of Seti I in Abydos, and we see the pharaoh Seti showing his young son Ramesses II a list of all the kings of Egypt who'd ruled before them. And that list goes back through the historical pharaohs who we know about, back to round about the date that we would call 3000 BC, when Egyptian civilization is supposed to have begun, but it doesn't stop there. It keeps on going back. It back thousands and thousands and thousands of years before that, until the time of the gods, the time that the ancient Egyptians called Zep-Tepi, the first time, when the gods brought civilization to Egypt. That's what the pharaoh is showing his son, a connection to the gods, going back thousands of years into the past. And from the tomb of Seti I, again, we see this idea. It goes right the way back to the god Osiris. Here showing the way to the future Horus kings of Egypt, how they should live, how they should create a kingdom, how it should be in harmony between earth and heaven. Everything goes back to the first time, to the time of the gods, to the time of Osiris. Temple of Horus at Edfu. Horus is the son of Osiris in the traditions of the ancient Egyptians. At this temple of Horus, there are whole walls covered with texts. And those texts are known as the Edfu building texts. This is what they look like. And they're very mysterious. Many people, many archaeologists will tell you that there is no flood tradition in Egypt. This is absolute nonsense. They clearly have not read the Edfu building texts, because the Edfu building texts speak of a homeland of the primeval ones. They say it was an island. They say it's where the gods lived. They say there was a great flood there, which utterly destroyed it. And that those gods who survived came to Egypt, settled in Egypt, and started to re-establish what they had had before. They built what were called primeval mounds all over Egypt, which were to be the sites of all future temples and religious structures in Egypt. Is it possible that some of the monuments of ancient Egypt are actually much older than the Egyptologists tell us? Here's the Osirion in Abydos, named after the god Osiris. And it's a very curious structure, gigantic blocks of stone. 100-ton weights are very common in the Osirion. And weirdly, it's close to 100 feet lower than the nearby temple of Seti I. Now, Egyptologists attribute this monument to Seti I. But it actually appears to have been built at a much earlier phase. It's just so much lower down. It's like there's been an accumulation of silt on top of it, and then thousands of years later, Seti I came along and built his temple. And then when the archaeologists excavated it, they said, well, that's by Seti I. This is nearby. It must be by Seti I. There's no good evidence connecting it to Seti I at all. The Great Sphinx of Giza. I'm not going to go into detail into Robert Schoch's and John Anthony West's extraordinary work on the rainfall erosion of the Sphinx, but it has thrown a real spanner in the works of Egyptology, and the Egyptologists are still very upset about it. You know, how dare a geologist suggest that the Sphinx actually might be thousands of years older than it's supposed to be, because that is what Schoch and West are suggesting, that these erosion patterns in the trench surrounding the Sphinx, which we would have seen on the body of the Sphinx too if it had not been restored again and again down the ages, that this erosion pattern can only be caused by exposure to thousands of years of heavy, heavy rainfall. And no such rainfall fell in Egypt in 2500 BC when the Sphinx is supposed to have been built. You have to go back to the end of the last ice age to find that massive precipitation that could have caused this level of weathering in Egypt. And these extraordinary temples that stand in front of the Sphinx were created from the limestone that was quarried out around the body of the Sphinx to create the body. Therefore, they are as old as the Sphinx. If the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, then so are these temples. And these temples, like mighty memorials of a forgotten past, are really hard to explain. There are blocks of stone, again, in the range of 100 tons in these temples, and they just have been built up as though it's an easy thing to do, as though it's easy to manipulate 100-ton blocks of stone. Now, the three great pyramids standing above the modern city of Cairo. That atmosphere of strangeness and mystery cannot be escaped. Let's take a quick flight around the Great Pyramids of Giza. We're looking from the east side here over the village of Nazlet al-Saman, the Great Pyramid pyramid of Khephren, supposedly the pyramid of Menkaure. We'll come around again, swinging around to the west side now. This is the north face of the Great Pyramid. The second pyramid, the third pyramid. Can you see the Sphinx, by the way? This is the Sphinx down here. The Sphinx is 270 feet long and 80 feet high, but it's dwarfed by the pyramids. It almost disappears from view. And here's the Valley of the Nile off to the east. So let's just come in closer and closer to these amazing monuments. The top of the Great Pyramid, 480 feet above the ground, a flattened area on top of the Great Pyramid there. And there I am, on top of the Great Pyramid. Now, I'm not showing this picture for, well, that's how I used to look in those days. Ah, sweet bird of youth. How quickly does she fly? We climbed up the southwest face there, the southwest corner. And actually, I've climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times. 3 of the climbs were legal, and 2 were illegal. This was one of the illegal climbs. And on one of the climbs, when I had more time, because I was up there legally and the police weren't going to arrest me, Santa and I, we spent some time looking around at the graffiti on top of the Great Pyramid. It's astonishing. There's graffiti going back hundreds of years up there. Even Mercator, that map maker, he left his graffiti up there. Loads of people have been climbing the Great Pyramid and leaving their graffiti. Including, I found, and this was an astonishing moment for me, one step down, just behind me there, is a piece of graffiti that says, P. Hancock, April 5th, 1916. My grandfather was called Philip Hancock. He was in Egypt in 1916. After we got down off the pyramid, I called my dad, he was still alive then, and asked him to look at my grandfather's diary. What did he say for the date of April 5th, 1916? One single line: climbed the Great Pyramid today. It was an extraordinary moment for me. And there's something about this place. It's like flying on a magic carpet above the city of Cairo. It's such a privilege, such a gift to be able to go there. I don't want to bore you with statistics. It's just 13.1 acres. It weighs 6 million tons. It's got 2.3 million blocks of stone. It's 481 feet high. It just is the most amazing thing. You know, it's just, you can look at it and just kind of miss it, and then you look at it closely and you begin to realize you're looking at something that's utterly impossible. I just want to take you on a quick journey around some of the interior of the Great Pyramid. I think we'll start down here in the so-called subterranean chamber, which is 600 feet vertically beneath the apex of the pyramid and about 100 feet beneath the base. It's carved out of solid rock. They went 300 feet, a sloped corridor, sloping at an angle of 26 degrees. You have to go 300 feet down it, and then you reach this chamber at the bottom. So they had to make that chamber, they had to cut down through the rock 300 feet. It's about 3 feet 6 inches high and the same wide, so you have got to go down like this, all the way down. And you get to the bottom, and here's this rock-hewn chamber, deep underground. And here's a couple of likely lads in the rock-hewn chamber. That's me and my friend Robert Boval, the author of the Orion Mystery, just to give you a sense of the size of the room. Now, coming out of the subterranean chamber, let's go back up this passageway which leads to it. There it is, cut from solid rock, as I described. And then you come to this junction here, and you go up the so-called ascending corridor and along a horizontal passage that leads you to the so-called Queen's Chamber. We don't know what the builders of these pyramids called these chambers. All these names are modern attributions. Let's just take a quick look inside the Queen's Chamber. The statistics are there. There's these curious little shafts in the walls of the Queen's Chamber. Up until the 1870s, this shaft was not visible it was covered by a block of stone. When they completed the chamber, they closed it. But a British Freemason called Wayman Dixon, who'd noticed that there were shafts in the chamber above, the King's Chamber, wondered if there might be shafts in the Queen's Chamber, and he went around tapping the walls, and he found these hollow points, cut out the stone, and sure enough, there's these shafts, and my friend Robert Boval has established the astronomical connections of these shafts. That the Queen's Chamber shafts point, the southern shaft, this one, points to Sirius, and the northern shaft points to Beta Ursa Minor. Very curious thing, especially since these shafts actually do not exit on the outside of the pyramid. The ones from the King's Chamber do, but these ones don't. And back in 1993, a German robotics engineer, Rudolf Gantenbrink, sent a little robot up that shaft, and 165 feet up the shaft, the robot came to this door with two metal handles. Rudolf Gantenbrink was immediately banned from doing any further work in Egypt and was sent away. The project was taken over by the Egyptian government. Some years later, Zahi Hawass sent another robot up the shaft with a mission to drill through that door and find out what was on the other side. And there we go, there's the drill, there's the door, there's the hole that they made. You know what they found on the other side? A space and another door. It's like an invitation. Search me. The pyramid is saying, search me, but I'm not going to make it easy for you. You're really going to have to figure this thing out. We still don't know what's at the end of that shaft. Okay, so we're going to come out of the Queen's Chamber, back along the horizontal corridor. Now we're looking up the grand gallery, 153 feet long, 28 feet high. This is called a corbel vault. Each level protrudes slightly over the level below it and narrows up towards the ceiling. Well, these blocks weigh about 70 tons each. They're laid at an angle of 26 degrees. You can't get a sheet of paper between the joints. They're unbelievably precise. It's like being compared to opticians' work on a scale of acres. An astonishing feat of construction. The work of giants, really. At the top of the grand gallery, you have an entrance to the King's Chamber. This is the King's Chamber here. And above the King's Chamber, not known until the early 19th century, are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more chambers. And getting into those chambers is really fun. I'll come to that in a moment. But let's first of all go into the King's Chamber. And this is what the King's Chamber looks like. Those are those shafts again. This is the northern shaft, the southern shaft's on this side. One pointing to Orion's belt, and the other again pointing to one of the circumpolar stars. It's a beautiful geometric room. It's made of granite blocks. The Great Pyramid is a limestone monument. These granite blocks were brought about 500 miles from Aswan. They were lifted to a height of hundreds of feet above the ground and put into position in this extraordinary chamber in the heart of the pyramid. There is a sarcophagus in it. I and my colleagues believe that this is not a sarcophagus that ever contained the body of the pharaoh Khufu, or of any pharaoh. We think that it was involved in some kind of process, some kind of initiation. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But because there is a sarcophagus in it, immediately the assumption has been made that this must have been the burial chamber of Khufu. Let's look at this setup again here. The King's Chamber, the so-called relieving chambers up above it, rather similar to the Jed pillar, the symbolic backbone of Osiris, which is a symbol of resurrection and rebirth in the ancient Egyptian religion. It seems that they were creating a symbol of resurrection, of rebirth within the Great Pyramid. To get into those rooms, here's what you do. You put a ladder 30 feet high up against this wall, and you lean it up against that side there, and there's a little hole just a bit wider than me, which fortunately a rope now hangs out of, and you grab hold of that rope, haul your body into it, pull yourself through, and then you get into a narrow tunnel, and that leads you into the first, eventually into all 5 of these chambers. And I'll just take you to the top chamber, That's that one up there. And again, these extraordinary, huge blocks of stone. These are in the range of 100 tons each, which form the floor of this chamber, and indeed all the other chambers again have these gigantic blocks of stone, which are almost impossible to move, really, but there they are. More graffiti inside. Sister M.T. Martin, 6th of February 1915. Oh, there's me with one of my kids, Layla. Again, just to show you the size and the scale of the thing. We'll go back to the pyramids. Here is the only evidence that Egyptologists are able to cite which connects the Great Pyramid to the pharaoh Khufu. And that is a cartouche which appears to say the name Khufu, that is found in that very topmost relieving chamber that I showed you. It's round about over here somewhere. And there are no other inscriptions whatsoever inside the Great Pyramid, not one. But this graffiti, as it's referred to, is supposed to be what's called a quarry mark that was put on the blocks by the gangs of construction workers who were quarrying out the blocks that would be built into the Great Pyramid. And they said, this is Khufu's block, or something like that. It's not very convincing evidence that the pyramid was built by Khufu or for Khufu. There is a hint of doubt over the authenticity of the cartouche itself. Could it have been forged by Howard Weiss, who found it in the early 19th century? But one thing's for sure, if Khufu was the builder of the pyramid, he had a pretty small ego for such a big monument. This is the only statue of Khufu that's ever survived. It's about 2 inches high. And, you know, you would have thought he'd have put his name all over this thing instead of just on some bit of graffiti up in a block in a chamber that nobody's ever going to see. But he didn't. It's absolutely bare. There are no texts, nothing in there that tells you what's going on. However, if you go down to Saqqara, about 15 miles south of Giza, you will come to a group of pyramids dating from the 5th and 6th dynasties, not the 4th dynasty, which this one supposedly dates to. And those pyramids are filled with text. Now, I'm just showing this overlay. Actually, I'm going to give away Santa's secret. She did this by accident. Because Santa, we were at Giza. Santa took a shot of the pyramids of Giza. Then we went down to Saqqara and we went into the pyramid of Unas. And Santa took a photograph of the pyramid of Unas, and we got this double exposure where the pyramid of Unas is overlaid on the Giza pyramids. And here are the so-called pyramid texts, the star-covered ceiling of the pyramid of Unas, and the pyramid texts on the walls. And these pyramid texts are the earliest surviving recensions of what we now know as the Books of the Dead, the ancient Egyptian Books of the Dead, and they concern the mystery of life and death and what it is we're doing on this planet. They're very deep, they're very profound. And they are, it seems to me that they were putting in writing there what the Great Pyramid does in architecture alone. The Great Pyramid does it entirely symbolically in architecture. In the later pyramids, they expressed it in texts. And all of these texts, whether it's the pyramid texts, which are the oldest surviving, the coffin texts, because they're written inside the lids of coffins, the book of what is in the Duat, which you'll find painted on the walls of many of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and the Books of the Dead, which were papyrus scrolls that were placed with the deceased inside the coffin. All of these seek to prepare us for the journey that the ancient Egyptians believed that we will face, that we will confront on our own deaths.
They identified a very large geometrical chamber, about 15 feet beneath the forepaws of the Sphinx. I think there's a lot more remains to be discovered under the Giza plateau. He said that the Hall of Records of Atlantis lay beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx. The reasons that I would never seek to divorce the ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramids there are several reasons, actually. But first and foremost, I have no doubt that the ancient Egyptians were involved in completing the Great Pyramids, and there's 4 reasons for that. And that is the shafts, the so-called air shafts, that cut through the body of the Great Pyramid. They're very small. They're about that wide, that high. There are two of them in the so-called King's Chamber, one on the north wall, one on the south wall. And they always exited on the outside of the pyramid. And that was known back into the 19th century. 19th century explorers could actually climb the Great Pyramid and roll a cannonball into one of those shafts, and it would end up in the King's Chamber. So obviously they were connected. The shafts in the so-called Queen's Chamber, and I use the word so-called because we actually don't know what these chambers were for. No burial of any pharaoh was ever found inside the Great Pyramid. The so-called Queen's Chamber, the shafts don't exit on the outside of the Great Pyramid, and nor until 1872 were they visible within the Queen's Chamber itself. They'd been closed off with little facing blocks. You couldn't see that they were there. But one researcher went around tapping on the walls. He thought, there's shafts upstairs in the King's Chamber. Maybe there are here. And he found two hollow points, one on the north wall, one on the south wall, broke them open, and lo and behold, there were the concealed shafts. Now, the thing about those shafts is that all four of them point at key stars, one of them being the lowest of the three stars of Orion's belt, in the position in the sky that they occupied around 2,500 BC, not 12,500 years ago, but 4,500 years ago. And that astronomical connection to the stars at that time says to me, we cannot divorce the ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramid. But then there's a problem. The ground pattern on the three pyramids on the ground reflects the pattern of Orion's belt itself. And this is, of course, no accident within the ancient Egyptian system, because the constellation of Orion was seen as the celestial image of the god Osiris, the civilization bringer, the entity who went around the world teaching civilization. That is who Osiris is, and he is seen in the sky. His image is seen in the sky as the constellation of Orion, and one of those shafts points at Orion's belt, and another one points at Sirius, and two of them point at the circumpolar stars. At the time when Egyptologists believed the pyramids were built. So there's definitely a connection, and I wouldn't seek to break it. But the problem is that the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground is the pattern of the three stars of the belt of Orion. And this has also changed subtly over the ages as a result of precession. So although the shafts in the Great Pyramid lock that monument to the epoch of 2,500 BC, the pattern of the pyramids on the ground reflecting Orion's belt, effectively it's like you want to make a painting of Orion's belt. You paint it on an easel and then you lay it down flat in front of you. That's what you have on the Giza Plateau. They reflect the pattern of Orion's belt and its relationship to the Milky Way. The Great Pyramids and their relationship to the River Nile reflect the sky of 12,500 years ago, not 4,500 years ago. A very complicated situation here. Ground pattern, speaking of what the ancient Egyptians called Zep-Tepi the first time, 12,500 plus years ago, and the star shafts connecting also to the time of the ancient Egyptians themselves. So no wonder it's a difficult monument to figure out, but it speaks to both epochs. We could say that the ancient Egyptians themselves had a sufficiently advanced knowledge of precession to be able to visualize the skies of 8,000 years previously. That would be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But then we're confronted with the problem of the Sphinx. I mentioned that lion-bodied monument. That lion monument that I believe stood there 12,500 years ago, looking at the rising sun when it was housed by the constellation of Leo. That lion monument has been subjected to thousands of years of erosion. And I want to pay tribute to the brilliant work of two individuals. The late, great John Anthony West, dear friend of mine, the first to raise the possibility that the Great Sphinx had been subjected to some kind of water weathering, and that creates a problem in itself, because 4,500 years ago, the Giza Plateau was as dry and as waterless as it is today. And then Professor Robert Schoch from Boston University, and kudos to Robert Schoch, putting his reputation as an established academic on the line, and looking at the geology of that site, and coming to the conclusion, and publishing the conclusion, that the Great Sphinx was subjected to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. Not a flood, but precipitation, rainfall coming from above, selectively hollowing out the softer areas of rock and leaving the harder areas of rock in place. And it's that precipitation-induced weathering that you see more in the trench around the Great Sphinx now than you see on the Sphinx itself, because the Sphinx has been constantly restored. This is one of the anomalies. We know that some of the restoration blocks were put there in the time of the pharaoh who's supposed to have been responsible for the Sphinx. And not a single document tells us that he was responsible. That's just another Egyptological fantasy, actually. The Great Sphinx was subjected to about 1,000 years of heavy rainfall, and that's the only time you find that heavy rainfall on the Giza Plateau is the Younger Dryas. Between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. You certainly didn't find it 4,500 years ago when the Sphinx is supposed to have been made. So we're looking at a very old monument, very heavily eroded. In the time of the ancient Egyptians, they looked at that massive leonine head, which was so damaged and so eroded, almost unrecognizable, and they recarved what was left of it into the head of a human being, wearing the Nemes headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. That is a recarving of a much more ancient monument. That's a restoration work that was done on it. And we don't know which pharaoh it's supposed to represent. Egyptologists like to think that it represents Khafre. There's no compelling evidence for that whatsoever. So a lion-bodied monument, once a lion-headed monument, that now takes the form of the lion-bodied Great Sphinx with a recarved human head that's way out of proportion to the scale of the rest of the body of that 270-foot-long monument. The head is sort of tiny by comparison with the rest of the body. And the ancient Egyptians didn't get things out of proportion unless there was a very good reason to do so. And I think they were restoring a very damaged and much older leonine head.
Is there not a hidden chamber as well under the Sphinx?
Yes. While work was allowed to be done, John Anthony West and Robert Schoch were both involved in this work back in 1992. They did a seismic survey around the Sphinx, and they identified a very large geometrical chamber, about 15 feet beneath the forepaws of the Sphinx. Could be a natural cavity, but the rectangular form of it suggests strongly that human beings
was dug out or something.
Yeah, that it was made. And in fact, there is a whole underworld at Giza. This is beginning to be recognized. The so-called Tomb of Osiris is an example of this. That subterranean chamber beneath the Great Pyramid is an example of this. I think there's a lot more remains to be discovered under the Giza Plateau. What is needed is seismic tomography, and that will show you a picture of what is underneath the Giza Plateau. And whenever that's been done, it's identified chambers, passageways, corridors, and not enough is being said about this. I think they're just so locked into their paradigm that they can't see what's there.
They feel like they've got it figured out.
They've got it figured out.
No reason to waste resources.
Exactly. No reason to waste the resources, and they don't want to get mixed up in any way with this crowd of kind of quote-unquote New Age thinkers like Graham Hancock. Edgar Cayce was a healer. He used to fall into a trance-like state. And in that trance-like state, primarily what he did was offer remedies for people's ailments.
Yeah.
But from time to time, he would start talking about Atlantis and about the lost civilization of prehistoric antiquity. And he said that the Hall of Records of Atlantis lay beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx. Well, immediately for scientifically minded Egyptologists, this is something to get as far away from as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
So they kind of neglect the fact that there are ancient Egyptian texts that speak precisely of that, precisely of a Hall of Record. Edgar Cayce didn't know about those texts. He was tapping in from some other realm into this, but that's one of the reasons that Egyptologists have distanced themselves so much from the notion that there might be something hidden there. Oddly enough, both Mark Lehner, who is the leading American Egyptologist doing work around the Great Sphinx and on the Giza Plateau, and Zahi Hawass, who's the leading Egyptian Egyptologist doing work around the Giza Plateau, both of them were sent through college by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Wow. Robert Baval and I published this in our 1996 book, The Message of the Sphinx. It was published in America as The Message of the Sphinx and in Britain as Keeper of Genesis, and we documented it. It's all there if anybody wants to check it out. Very rapidly afterwards, they distanced themselves completely from the Edgar Cayce organization, but until quite recently, Zahi Hawass was still giving lectures at the Edgar Cayce Foundation, while at the same time insisting that he had nothing to do with any of these so-called crazy ideas.
The Great Pyramid of Giza is probably the most stunning of all these ancient structures. And the stones are immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away. How do you think they did that?
Well, some of them, the granite in the Great Pyramid comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Stunning detail.
Stunning detail. Those blocks on the roof of the King's Chamber weigh 70 tons each. Now, Egyptologists will tell you that, they could move heavy blocks because they put them on wet sand and they push them along on wet sand. Well, maybe if you're just at ground level, that will do. But when you're 350 feet above the ground, as you are in the King's Chamber, that won't do at all. I don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology. And it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks almost completely. Not entirely completely because there were survivors, but removed most of it. Randall will tell you, sea level rise, it creates a powerful high energy zone. Mm-hmm. Anything that was existing on those flooded coastlines has just been pounded to hell. I mean, talk about it, Randall.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a lot more energetic than now. I mean, imagine your sea level rising at 3 or 4 times at least faster than we've seen rise in the last century. And within there, juxtaposed, are these episodes of very rapid sea level rise. So you're talking about a very energetic intertidal zone. And anything that's there, short of large megalithic blocks, is going to be utterly obliterated by the time the process is through. And I think that this is one of the things that, the archaeologists and the prehistorians, people are looking at that, have failed to take into account the severity of these events we're talking about. Because the question always is, where are the artifacts? Where's the pottery? Where is the evidence that this civilization existed? And I have 2 responses to that. One, you don't realize the extent of the total remodeling of this planetary surface that took place. Because, I mean, we could get into some of the stuff here. I have tons of images where I think maybe we'll get a chance to pull up a couple of really awesome drone footage here before we're done. But once you begin to wrap your head around it, you go, really? It's like, imagine that you drop an atomic bomb on a city and it completely obliterates it. And then a short while later, you drop another one on the same place. What's going to be left? And then 10,000 years, 20,000 years goes by. What are you going to find? What are you going to look for? It's going to be just rubble that gets reincorporated just into the geological stratum, and this is going to be very difficult to differentiate, for example, from what's called a conglomeratic rock, which is basically we have just a huge jumble of broken rock cemented together. Right? Now, within there could be all kinds of stuff that's not even recognized as being artificial in the sense that humans had anything to do with it. The other thing is when we talk about these ancient technologies, if we're only looking for a mere reflection of ourselves, we could overlook it completely, because I think there's evidence that exists now. I mean, some modern researchers whose work has been buried or suppressed, I think we're getting very close to rediscovering some of the things that our ancient ancestors were up to. And maybe this would be worth a whole show in itself. We could dive into this, and I don't want to get into that today.
But what kind of technologies are you talking about?
Well, I shouldn't really get into that.
Get into it.
Get into
Come
it,
on.
Randall.
We got to get into it.
Okay, well...
We've opened the door, sir.
Okay. Well, okay.
The passing of the HDMI cable.
The passing
a sacred moment.
Well, there are people out there now who have been working on trying to rediscover that. And again, I don't want to digress too much into this now, because I would really rather be able to give a whole treatment of it. And it might kind of derail us a little bit from this. But there are people who've been working on these things for decades now, basically in secret. And I've had the privilege of talking to some of these people over the last 6 or 7 years. And right now, as we're speaking, there's a group of people who are basically going to open source a whole lot of stuff in the next 3 months, so it can never get suppressed again. And that's why I'd like to come back and talk in more detail.
Well, I'd love to have you come back and talk about it, but we got to talk about it a little bit now.
Okay. Well, there's a laboratory right now in the Maldives that's been building prototypes using these technological principles, which are based on implosion rather than explosion. And the inspiration for this...
Tesla's ideas are part of it, I think you mentioned.
Tesla's ideas are very much a part of it. Yes, Tesla's ideas are very much a part of it. So is, I don't know if you ever, Victor Schauberger, who did the work with water and discovered, look at, Jamie, could you look up Victor? Oh, I have the cable now, don't I?
Take it back. Let me find it.
Well, no. Let me pull something up here, and
I think the key thing is we're looking at technologies that are not the same as ours.
Yes.
And that's partly
that's the
why
point.
archaeologists can't see them, because they're looking for us in the past, and they're not open to the possibility that there are whole other kinds of technology that could be used.
Right.
I always go back to the ancient Egyptian traditions that speak of priests chanting as these huge blocks were lifted into the air. Were they using some kind of sound effect, some kind of use of sound that was able to manipulate matter? We know that sound can manipulate matter, as a matter of fact, but they're lifting these blocks. Again and again, it appears in ancient Egyptian traditions. The notion that we could lift huge blocks with sound seems absurd to archaeologists, and yet it's there in the traditions of the Egyptologists. And what Randall's talking about now is people who are working on a whole alternative path of technology, and maybe that's a rediscovery of the kind of technologies that were used by a lost civilization.
I think that's what's important about what you're saying, is that we have this very limited idea of technology based on what we've experienced.
Yeah.
But if you had anatomically similar human beings that lived for thousands and thousands of years.
Stuff just keeps on getting older.
If you think about the amount of progress that we've achieved as modern humans just in the last few hundred years, if you go back 400 years to now, it's a stunning amount of achievement.
Absolutely stunning.
And if you have a completely different path of technology, one that's not utilizing internal combustion engines and cranes and the like that we experience
leverage,
today.
mechanical advantage, everything that our tech is based around.
Something that's insanely advanced, tens of thousands of years of a different path.
Yeah.
And that may be what we're looking at.
And that may begin to explain these otherwise inexplicable monuments that have survived.
Jamie, do I need... There we go. This is the work of Nikola Tesla. And he was... Again, this is way too much for us to get in today. That's why we need to devote a whole session to talking about this.
Okay.
But this is... this was the inspiration. You know, his work was suppressed. A lot of his patents were taken, sealed up by the U.S. government for whatever reason. I don't know. But this is some of the stuff that's now being developed using his ideas, plus some of the others. This is the man I've been talking to for the last 7 years.
Malcolm Bendall?
Yes. And again, I don't want to get into it today, but here's an example of what they're doing. This is a generator that has no moving parts. It's all based on geometry, pure geometry. Mm-hmm. And here's the basic idea, as I think I understand it at this point. Resonance frequencies. Everything vibrates. Have you ever, if we had an electric razor, we plugged it in, turned it on, set it on this table, it's going to move around, isn't it? You ever seen that?
Yeah.
That's the beginning of the concept, because it's vibrating. Everything vibrates at a frequency, and if you know that frequency, you can control things. And I think that's the basic idea of what we're looking at here. And it's all based upon the ancient numbers. And they're developing technologies right now, and they have been. I was recently contacted and given the go-ahead that I could talk. I've been sitting on this for 7 years without talking about it, because they asked me not to talk about it until they had their patents in place and their licensing. That's all happened since last summer. So we're now free to talk about it. So that's what I'm saying. I think it would be a good idea to get me back on here. We can look at it. I'm going to lay this on Graham so he can look at it too, because I really want to get Graham's feedback on this.
I mean, would it be fair to say that there's an element of a rediscovery of a lost technology from the past?
I think it would be fair to say that, yes.
And so through somehow through this technology, they're able to move stones or cut stones or all the above?
All the above.
And even transport them? Whoa,
Yes.
what is all this?
Well, this is the model, and this is diagramming all the frequencies of the elements and what their vibrational frequencies are and the numbers that measure those frequencies. And they're all the numbers we get from looking at these ancient traditions that recur over and over and over again, that I've been talking about in my sacred geometry classes for decades without knowing what the final result was going to be. So this inventor who's working with this small group contacted me, and this is what he told me. He said, you built the foundation. He said, you laid the foundation with your work on ancient geometry, and I built a house on top of it.